Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted to be with Dr. Max Baker-Lynch. How are you doing, Max?
I'm very well, thank you, Sabur. It's great to be with you.
So thank you for giving us your time and allowing the viewers to see you live, and so we can get the best out of you. So Max, just before we get into what we're going to be speaking about today, the argument from reason, I wanted to give a short introduction to yourself. So you're a
Mm.
tutor in philosophy at Oxford University in the Faculty of Philosophy. You received a DPhil in philosophy from Oxford in 2014. You went on to hold two postdoctoral research fellowships, one at Oxford and one at the University of Notre Dame, before taking up your current position. And you have quite a few publications. I'm going to be just sharing the actual link for anybody who wants to know who is our guest today. So this is Dr. Max, and you can see he's been quite busy with a lot of I mean, your general area seems to be epistemology and theology. That
Mm.
seems to be your sort of niche.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, epistemology, philosophy of religion. And I should say, sorry to plug one other thing that isn't on that list of publications, a book that I've got in the Cambridge University Press series, Elements. So yeah, if you can find that if you just type in my name, and the title of the book is God and the Problem of Evidential Ambiguity. But yeah, so that's a book that came out recently.
Brilliant. So while you're speaking, I'll search for that and share the screen as well. So Max, I mean, there's a lot of things that could be said about the argument from reason, its history,
Mm.
its impact, its reception, and its plausibility as well. So let's begin off with, I guess, a introductory sort of question. Why is this important to you as an argument?
Well, yeah, I should say, Sabur, that I think it's a family of arguments. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about C.S. Lewis's role in developing an argument in this area, but yeah, I basically think that arguments from reason are a kind of family of arguments that, a bit like design arguments are a family of arguments. There's the
Mm.
fine-tuned argument, but there's also, Dustin Crummett has recently sort of put forward what seems to be a new type of design argument from psychophysical harmony. Okay, there's arguments that, there's kind of biological design arguments, etc., etc. So basically, I think arguments from reason are a family of arguments that point to certain features of our mental life, and claim that they are somehow kind of surprising or don't fit well within a naturalistic picture. And so, yeah, I think, as with all these things, not all of the arguments in that family are equally strong, but I do
Yeah,
think there is something in that general vicinity that's worth exploring.
yeah. And this goes back to, I guess, many thinkers, not just philosophers, but also scientists, worrying about the reliability of our faculties, going back all the way to Darwin.
Yep.
Darwin famously doubted
Yeah.
our reasoning abilities because of natural selection not being able to, um, you know, choose true beliefs over false beliefs, but rather what's better for the organism. I had Professor Rosenberg on this stream about a week ago, I believe,
Mm.
and I put this question to him
Yeah.
when it comes to um, his radical empiricism, his radical scientism, and
Yeah.
some of his conclusions, which are not accepted by even other naturalists. I asked him, well, is it the case that you know natural selection has designed us not to accept truth as easily as we may think?
Absolutely. And Alvin Plantinga, who's an important philosopher in this area, who's developed an argument that I would see as, maybe we'll come on to talk about it in a bit more detail, but I would see his argument as belonging to the family of arguments from reason. And and Plantinga cites quite a number of these naturalist philosophers. You mentioned Alex Rosenberg already, but he also mentions Patricia Churchland and Daniel Dennett as saying things that sound like if one took them seriously, there wouldn't be good grounds to trust the deliverances of our cognitive faculties.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things that you were working on is to develop and update, I guess, the argument. Just before we get into that, it'd be nice for the viewers to know about, the history of this with C.S. Lewis and how it helped him
Yeah.
leave atheism.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the place to start with Lewis is that so he did begin as an atheist, and he ended up as a theist, indeed a Christian theist. But there seemed to be a number of steps on that journey. It wasn't kind of all in one go. And one of the earlier steps in that journey, he credits to a friend of his called Owen Barfield, who he used to spar with. Kind of intellectually, they would debate long into the night when they were both tutors at Oxford, I guess, in the 1920s. And essentially, Lewis credits Barfield with pointing out to him what Lewis felt was a serious internal inconsistency within the atheistic, or perhaps specifically kind of materialistic view of the world, where everything at bottom is just kind of mass energy. And so, Lewis basically was convinced by Barfield to come to the conclusion that if he accepted the idea that essentially all of his reasoning was at bottom just the collocation of atoms and so on, atoms swerving in the void, as some of the ancient Greeks might have put it, that wasn't compatible with thinking that one should trust the deliverance of one's reason, essentially.
Yeah, sorry, I put myself on mute because I was looking for your Elements book. I actually managed to find it, so I think, I think I'll plug that right at the end. So, I mean, that's a good introduction. Now, Lewis obviously developed this argument, and obviously, I believe I wouldn't say that there was a major upgrade that he did, but he did sort of try and reinforce it.
That's right. And there were two stages to this, really. So in the 1948 version of Lewis's book, Miracles, which I have to say is really is hard to get hold of now, because he updated it and gave a second edition, and I'll explain why in a minute. But it's hard to find that original version. But basically, in that original version in 1948, he drew a distinction between two types of causes of a belief. So, suppose I have the belief that it's going to rain tomorrow. We might ask the question, what caused my belief? And we could answer that in terms of rational causes, such as that, I acquired evidence from the weather forecast and I based my belief on that, etc. We could answer it in terms of physical causation. Sound waves coming from the radio vibrated my eardrums, causing neural signal electrical impulses in the auditory nerve, etc., etc. Now, basically, what Lewis wants to do in this original version of the argument, as he presents it, is to say that if materialism is true, if at bottom everything, if all our thinking processes are just the collocation of atoms and so on, then our beliefs are fully explained by irrational causes, as he put it. And so, so he wants to conclude that, essentially our beliefs, all of our beliefs are irrational if that materialistic picture is true. Now, he then had what some people say was quite a bruising encounter with the famous philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe at the Socratic Club, which is a kind of philosophical debate club. And basically, Anscombe gave a few pointed objections to Lewis's presentation, and it gave Lewis some real food for thought, basically. So, in a nutshell, Anscombe made 3 points, 3 particularly important points. So, one was she said that, well, it doesn't make sense to suppose that reasoning itself could be undermined. Okay, that's one thing she said. Another thing she said was that Lewis needs to distinguish between irrational causes and non-rational causes. And Anscombe wants to say, well, materialism only entails that beliefs have non-rational causes, but it doesn't follow that they can't also have rational causes. And so she, so yeah, the third point is kind of connected to this. She gave I suppose, an analogy to try and illustrate this thought. So basically, she suggested, look, you can have a purely physical, purely material causal explanation for something. The text of a printed book, you can explain it purely in terms of the machinery of a printing machine. But that non-rational cause, that material causal story, doesn't mean that we can't also posit a rational cause behind it. Okay, so essentially, on the basis of that kind of pretty well, as I said, many people say that Lewis was kind of chastened by this experience. Anyway, he went on to substantially revise the argument in 1960. And I'll try and be brief here, but I think he made a more careful distinction. So he distinguished between cause and effect relationship. Okay, so like when one snooker ball hits another snooker ball, that's a cause effect relationship. So he distinguishes between that type of relationship on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what he calls a ground consequent relation. So basically a logical relation. So for example, let me give you a very simple deductive argument. So all humans are mortal. Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, so there's a logical relationship between the steps of that argument, or what Lewis called a ground consequent relation. And so basically what Lewis wants to say then is that if materialism is true, then every step in a chain of reasoning is going to stand in the cause effect relationship, the billiard ball relationship, to the previous step. But for any train of thought, any chain of reasoning to have any value, or to be able to be the basis of a rational belief, the items in the chain need to stand in the logical relation to each other. Yeah. And his point was that there's no reason to suppose on materialism that the mere fact that two thoughts are linked in the cause effect relation, the billiard ball type relation, there's nothing from that would lead us to expect that they would be linked in the logical relation, that there would be the logical what he calls the ground consequent relation between them. And so I'll just read one key passage and then I'll hand back to you, Sabur. He says, even if grounds do exist, even if logical relations do exist, what have they got to do with the actual occurrence of belief as a psychological event? If it is an event, it must be caused, which is again the billiard ball relation. It must in fact be simply one link in a causal chain which stretched back to the beginning and forward to the end of time. How could such a trifle as a lack of logical grounds prevent the belief's occurrence? And how could the existence of grounds promote it? So yeah, I think that the gist there is basically that the fact that thoughts are going to be linked to each other in this cause-effect relation, like billiard balls on a billiard ball table, provides no guarantee whatsoever. In fact, it doesn't in any way lead us to expect that they would be connected in in terms of a logical relationship.
Yeah, that's a very good introduction actually to the actual history of how it was developed. And after Lewis, obviously it was developed further by many philosophers, including famously Plantinga, focusing on cognitive reliability. So before we get into these upgrades, could you go over the ontological commitments of naturalism? Because I think that's going to be important when we understand Plantinga's ideas.
Yeah, that absolutely. So, I mean, I think one thing that's important to say here is there isn't exactly kind of an agreed on definition of naturalism. It's famously hard to kind of pin down a definition of naturalism, but I think you can look at what various philosophers who identify as naturalists say, and you can draw out some themes, I think. And those three, I think you could see at least three themes. So one would be what we could call causal closure. So that's to say the universe is a closed system of cause and effect. So that's going to be very relevant to the whole kind of mind-brain issue, because even if you want to suppose that there's a immaterial soul, according to this first commitment of naturalism, that soul can't cause any it can't cause anything to happen in the material world. It's just along for the ride, as it were. But the second thing is, and this is going to rule out that immaterial soul even existing at all. The second thing is, second theme, as it were, is that all that exists is ultimately built out of the basic building blocks of physics, which is to say, kind of, this does get tricky, because some naturalists will want to say that, well, what's sort of kind of fundamental is whatever physics ends up saying is fundamental, but of course we don't know what that's going to be. But they will often want to say, but we don't know what it's going to be, but, and this leads me on to the third thing, we already know that whatever physics is going to say is fundamental, whatever particle, or whatever the right way to think about the basic physical building blocks of reality is, those things are going to be non-conscious and non-teleological. That's to say they're not going to have kind of purposes or intentions.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think any naturalist would really disagree with these three, I guess, some generalizations of their view. And obviously, Plantinga wanted to argue for theism and undermine naturalism at the same time. So it was a very ambitious project that he embarked on.
Yeah, that's right. So Plantinga, he does actually tip his hat to Lewis in terms of the inspiration for the argument. So the argument that Plantinga gives is basically going to pick up on actually the thing you were saying earlier, Sabur, about how even Darwin had expressed these doubts about whether an unguided process of natural selection would be likely to yield a mind that was let's say truth tracking. So Plantinga is going to basically try and exploit that thought, and what he's going to argue is that the combining these two beliefs, namely belief in naturalism as I've just kind of sketched it, and the belief that our minds are ultimately the product of an unguided process of natural selection. Those two beliefs generate what's known as a defeater. So a defeater is just kind of a reason to give up on a belief that you hold. So Plantinga is going to want to say that the belief in naturalism and that our minds are ultimately the result of this unguided process of natural selection is going to give anyone who holds those two beliefs a defeater for all of the beliefs produced by their cognitive faculties. And the reason he wants to say that you get this defeater if you hold those two beliefs is that natural selection selects for it selects for reproductive fitness, but so Plantinga argues it's entirely possible to have creatures who have cognitive systems that lead them into falsehood all the time, but nonetheless it gets their body parts into the right places so that they survive and reproduce. And at the end of the day, that's all that natural selection is able to kind of get a grip on.
Yeah. So we were having a little bit of technical issues. Your voice was cutting out slightly. Can you just
Sorry.
repeat the last thing you said?
Yeah. So the reason Plantinga wants to say that those two beliefs, belief in naturalism and belief in that our minds are the product of unguided natural selection, that those two things together are going to generate a defeater for all of one's beliefs produced by one's cognitive faculties, is that he claims that natural selection, and again, he's got these quotes to sort of back him up, as it were, from the likes of Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett, etc., suggesting that natural selection is selecting not for truth tracking minds, but for for cognitive systems that will get creatures' body parts in the right places to survive and reproduce. And so Plantinga's claim is that it's not probable, given naturalism and unguided evolution, it's not probable that our cognitive systems would reliably track the truth.
Yeah. Sorry, your voice. I could hear your voice, but your camera's actually frozen. I'm not sure if it's internet on yours. I can hear you, but it's just your camera's frozen. That put me off slightly. But it's fine. I understood what you said there. So he also then goes on to argue for theism using the same argument.
Yeah, so the way he does that is kind of indirectly here, because he essentially thinks that naturalism puts you in an untenable situation whereby it gives you a defeater for all of your cognitive for the beliefs, all of the beliefs produced by your cognitive faculties. And so yes, the only way to get out of this untenable epistemic situation is to drop the belief in naturalism. Now, obviously, that doesn't immediately. Oh, hi, Sabur, are you still there?
Okay, now we're back. I'm not sure why the internet here usually works really well. Just
So that is weird. And I think, I mean, it could be me, but the internet here has been very stable recently.
Okay,
should we start that question again about the last question you asked me?
Yeah, that's fine. If you just give me a moment to what I've done is I've decreased the quality of the stream so we can get a clear audio.
Okay.
And if you don't mind, if you can leave the studio and then come back.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's going to help. Let me try something on my phone. This is maybe this is going to help. Okay, now it seems to work. I've basically switched over from my internet to my mobile.
Oh, okay.
And now I can can see you clearly, I can hear you clearly, but literally last 10 minutes it was really difficult.
I'd be really happy if you want to go back and redo that stuff, Sabur. Whatever is best for you. Yeah.
I mean, if we go back to the question on theism, right? Because
Yeah.
what you said, I think the viewers got that. But if you go back to how he uses the argument from reason to argue for theism.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so Plantinga thinks that this having the belief in naturalism and you know, acquiring a defeater for all of the beliefs produced by your cognitive faculties leaves you in an untenable situation epistemically. And so yes, the only way out of that situation is to drop the belief in naturalism, he thinks. And now, of course, that's not going to take you straight to theism, because there are other alternatives in the possibility space besides naturalism and theism. But if you're thinking in a kind of probabilistic framework, that let's just suppose, for a very kind of rough and ready way of thinking, that your the probability space is divided in three. One part goes to naturalism, one to theism, and one to alternatives that are neither naturalism or theism. Well, if you knock out naturalism from the probability space, then theism now takes up half of your probability space. So the probability of theism on your total evidence has increased in this kind of probabilistic way of thinking about things. So yeah. Now, another way to think about it, and Plantinga actually doesn't do it this way, but what you could do is frame it a bit differently. So rather than putting it in terms of a sort of self-undermining problem for naturalists where they get a defeater for all their beliefs, what you could say is, no, let's take it as a starting point, take it as a datum that we do have reliable cognitive faculties. And then the question is, which worldview, which metaphysical picture best explains that? Naturalism or theism, or some kind of alternative which is neither. And then you could argue that theism gives a superior explanation for that datum. So that would be, as I said, I mean, I'm pretty sure Plantinga would sort of be sympathetic to that thought, but that's actually not the way he kind of sets it up in the way he lays the argument out.
Yeah. Although he may not explicitly do that, I think intuitively it does make sense that if we knock out naturalism as a contender, due to it not being able to give the framework to understand how our beliefs are reliable, how our reasoning capacities are justifiable, then automatically it just gives more credence to theism. Because remember, I think this is one of the mistakes that happens with the critique that some new atheists have of theist arguments, as if one argument is standalone.
Right.
All these arguments come together coherently, right? So the moral argument, the contingency argument, whatnot, and the argument from reason, it's like a package.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why I like these debates where there's discussions about what better explains reality.
Yeah.
Not just one particular area.
I'm completely with you on that. Yeah.
Okay, good. The next part is how you basically updated Plantinga's argument from reason.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to say, I haven't actually published on this, but yeah, as you saw me a while ago present at the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford on this, yeah, I mean, so basically, one of the perhaps unsurprisingly main objections to Plantinga's argument is that, well, evolution would select for reliable cognitive faculties because, well, creatures who have lots of false beliefs about their surroundings are inevitably going to be worse at navigating their way around, finding resources, mates, escaping predators than creatures who have more true beliefs about their surroundings. It seems kind of intuitive. And so there's that objection basically, which seeks to deny what Plantinga is claiming about the improbability of our having reliable cognitive faculties on naturalism.
Sorry to cut in, but I want to expand on this slightly, because I think this is an important premise to defend. When we look at the works of evolutionary psychologists who are speaking about how we are mismatched for our environment, and we have all these quirks and all these hangovers from when we were in the savannah, and we were in the environment evolutionary adaptation.
Right.
We are almost designed not to be in this world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this fast-paced world. So when it comes to moral decisions that we're going to make, or other inferences that we make in science in terms of what is relevant, what is not relevant, clearly natural selection is going to give us false beliefs, because it's not truth tracking, as you previously said. I was reading some years back an article written by some evolutionary thinker arguing that creationism was selected for.
Oh yes, is that Deborah Kellerman? Possibly.
I don't remember the name, but look, the point is, I think we can defend the premise that natural selection cannot be giving us reliable ways of detecting truth and true and false beliefs, and sometimes false beliefs are more adaptable than true beliefs. So when we have people like Rosenberg and others who really want to accept reality for what it is, they're very candid about these things. I mean, they point out things like patriarchy and other things that we have as being our biological inheritance. So I think maybe if you can expand upon the contention in detail, and
I mean, one thing, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are various evolutionary biologists and cognitive psychologists who will talk about having all of these cognitive biases, as you put it, that could be seen as our evolutionary heritage. The thing is that, of course, these thinkers can't be claiming that our cognitive faculties, cognitive abilities are unreliable in a really thoroughgoing way. Otherwise, they wouldn't take themselves to be in a position to have acquired the empirical knowledge to develop these theories about cognitive biases and so on. But yeah, I mean, so I think, one thing that does strike me as a plausible way to sort of nuance Plantinga's argument, so that it's okay. Let's just say, suppose that this objection is broadly right, that okay, you wouldn't expect 100% cognitive reliability on naturalism. You would expect these cognitive biases, but you would expect a kind of a reasonable level of reliability about at least about kind of matters that are pertinent to survival and reproduction. So you might expect us to have fairly reliable perceptual faculties, fairly reliable memory faculty, fairly reliable ability to do various sorts of inference and so on. But then the thought is, and this is how one might slightly nuance Plantinga's argument, the further the subject matter that we're thinking about gets, the further away it gets from the sorts of things that would have been relevant to survival, the less reason we have to suppose that naturalism would have given us faculties that could be extended to track truth in these domains, which, let's say kind of metaphysics, or calculus, cosmology, whatever it is. These domains are extremely far removed from survival concerns, and especially when Oh yeah, go for it.
Sorry to cut you off, Max. Just on that point, before you moved on, I wanted to get your thoughts on, Wallace's thinking when it came to the evolution of the mind, because this was his very concern. His concern was that if you take somebody from a primitive society, somewhere in Latin America, and you bring that person to, say, Cambridge, England, they, in their environment, they haven't had the stimulus to allow them to understand mathematics, philosophy, and all these sciences. Yet you bring them and they have that capacity, and it doesn't make sense according to their environment why they would have that, if you like, additional leeway, why natural selection would give you those capacities which are way more than what you need for your survival and reproduction. And so that gap made him doubt if natural selection can explain the mind, and he famously, moved away from Darwin in this regard. And there's a famous book, In Darwin's Shadow. We find out about Alfred Russel Wallace and his thinking. I've never heard you speak on this, so I just wanted your thoughts of how this will help with buttressing the argument.
That's really interesting. I didn't actually know that story about Wallace. But yeah, I mean, I think that's basically articulating the same sort of intuition that I was getting at. Yeah, and I think, well, let's think about it like this. I mean, philosophy, metaphysics involves, I think, unavoidably intuitions. There is kind of some debate about this amongst philosophers, but basically, I think that Michael Huemer put it quite well. It's not that philosophers who don't talk about intuitions are not using intuitions. It's just they're not being upfront about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems pretty clear to me that when we're doing a metaphysics, we do rely on intuitions, and indeed when we're doing epistemology, and actually also, one thing that has, I think, come out of discussions in philosophy of science over the last 100 years is that it's not really easy to quantify the criteria that scientists use to choose theories. Okay, there's not like you'd be really hard pressed to come up with an algorithm for figuring out which theory to choose. And so whatever that kind of judgment is that scientists are using, I think even more so, whatever that judgment is or intuition that philosophers are using, I think it's a real stretch to suppose that naturalism would have, unguided naturalistic processes would have led us to have a truth tracking kind of set of cognitive abilities for that thing.
Yeah. And additionally, the fact that we're curious. We're curious not just about, does that tree have fruit? We're curious about the size of the universe, what's inside a cell. We have all these these obsessions, and as what's it called, in Darwinian fairy tales, David Stove famously said, Darwinism is a slander on human beings, because he's pointing out how human beings want to do things which clearly don't fit survival and reproduction, sometimes to their own detriment. And one of the interesting things that we find sociologically is that people who are very intelligent don't have that many kids. So, it's just one of those. It's just one of those things that's very hard to explain under a naturalistic evolutionary paradigm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I did. One thing I would say is, so I want to be careful. None of the things. I mean, I don't think any of the things that either of us have been saying, entail a denial of some kind of biological evolution. Right. It's the combination of naturalism and evolution that's at issue here. Yes, I mean, I suppose, what the naturalists could say in terms of the curiosity thing. Now, I mean, part of the problem is, when it comes to evolutionary psychology, and you're well read in this area, but it does seem sort of overly easy to generate some kind of evolutionary just so story about why we would have this trait or that trait.
Yeah.
And it just feels a bit too easy to kind of throw out these hypotheses which aren't particularly testable.
Yeah.
But I suppose someone could come up with a just so story that said, well, early hominids who had this trait of curiosity were driven to kind of understand their environment in a deeper way than those who didn't, and so would be more apt to survive, especially when more tough conditions like famines or droughts, that kind of thing, came along. I don't know. I'm not saying that
Yes.
I necessarily would endorse that kind of theory, but I think that's what someone could say.
Yeah. No, I think that's good food for thought. Now, just to end on, Max, there's a few questions that you have for further reflection, which I thought were really interesting.
Yeah.
The first one is: do such arguments, these are arguments from reason, rely on the God of the gaps type reasoning, or is it plausible to suppose that they identify phenomena that are inexplicable in
Yeah.
principle in naturalism? So essentially, is it a defeater, or is it a
Yeah.
case that it's an inductive argument?
Yeah. Thanks, Sabor. I think I'm inclined to think that the phenomena we've been discussing, so our having cognitive reliability, and something else we haven't really talked about, the fact of our intentionality. So that's just kind of the aboutness of thoughts, the way that thoughts refer to something. The thoughts have meaning or semantic content. And that's kind of a really sort of puzzling thing, and not clear how you would fit that into a naturalistic picture. But in any case, I think that these kinds of arguments from reason,
Sorry,
as I said. Oh yeah.
sorry to butt in, but say if we were to take Rosenberg's view that the mind is simply the brain at work, and there is no such thing as these contents
Yeah.
of thought. I mean, what's your thoughts on his way of accepting these conclusions?
I mean, the problem is it looks really self-undermining, right? I mean, if you if you want to say there's our thoughts don't have any semantic content, then they can't have any truth values, right? They can't be either true or false. And so it looks like it's yeah, it
So
looks really self-undermining
yeah,
to hold something like that. So yeah, I mean, I suppose the reason I'm inclined to see these kinds of arguments we've been discussing as not just sort of, oh, here's a gap in the world that science hasn't yet filled, and let's put God in it. I'm inclined not to see it that way because, cognitive reliability, intentionality, um, the ability of thoughts to have a semantic content. There's other stuff besides that in this general area we could have talked about. All of this stuff is a presupposition of science.
yeah,
Science doesn't try to explain it so much as presuppose it before it can get off the ground. And so in the same way that people like Richard Swinburne have argued that the laws of nature, understood in a certain way, are not the kinds of things that one could give a scientific explanation for, because science ultimately presupposes those laws. In the same way, I think that's what I would want to say about these kinds of phenomena we've been discussing.
yeah, brilliant. And the last question I want to put to you, and this is really interesting, right? How effective are such arguments at supporting classical theism as opposed to non-naturalistic metaphysical views, panpsychism, pantheism, and so on?
Well, I go back and forth on this a bit. I think theism does have a bit of an edge, but I don't want to put it in overly confident terms here. I think basically naturalism has a much harder time at explaining cognitive reliability, etc., than any of these other worldviews do. But I suppose, on theism, you have a personal agent at the foundation of reality, whereas these other views, panpsychism, pantheism, and it gets a bit tricky in terms of what exactly is envisaged on pantheism, but say panpsychism, or like John Leslie's view, axiarchism, which is this sort of Platonic view where the form of the good kind of draws things into being. Somehow, but it's not supposed to be a kind of personal agent. The thing that those types of views are going to have trouble with is explaining, I think, why we should expect the processes that gave us our minds to have given us minds that track truth. Whereas if you have a personal agent, it's going to, particularly a personal agent with certain moral attributes, where there's, which would generate an expectation that the being who designed our cognitive faculties would value truth and would want us to value truth. If you don't have that in your metaphysical picture, I think it's still going to be somewhat surprising that we end up with truth tracking cognitive abilities.
I think that's a really brilliant way of putting it. That definitely gives an edge to theism over these other materialistic explanations. So thank you so much, Max, for your time today.
Thanks, Sibyl. Yeah, great to be with you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to share the book you spoke about. So this is in the Cambridge Element series. For those who don't know, can you just explain what the Element series is about?
Yes, sure. So it's, I suppose, well, probably most people are familiar with those Oxford very short introductions too. Now, those topics, those Oxford very short,
one lying around.
Oh yeah, there you go. But the thing about, I absolutely love those books. Normally the topics are quite big topics, like the philosophical method is the one you just showed us, or Buddhism, for example. So they're quite high. They have to necessarily be quite high level overviews. So with these Cambridge Elements, the topics are much narrower, and so it gives the author an opportunity to advance their own perspective, their own thesis, their own arguments on a particular topic. So but they're kind of similar length to those Oxford very short introductions too. And so specifically, the series that my book appeared in was called The Problems of God, and it's most of the books in that series are in some way sort of connected with philosophy of religion, but they are, I think it was supposed to be sort of slightly non-standard or new topics in the philosophy of religion. There you go. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Religious trauma and
yes, that's right.
Extremism, God and astrobiology, some really interesting. I mean, these Element books are excellent. I actually did a book review with Elliot Sober with his
nice.
Design Argument, the Element, the introductory book that he had, and it was really good, because I think what's needed is a supplement definitely to these, because these are very bird's eye view perspective, and it's nice to zoom in into an area. Well,
it's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
So before we end, what else are you working on currently?
Yeah, so I am now embarking on another book. This will be a longer book, and I'm co-authoring it with a philosophy PhD student called Daniel Woolner. We are basically, if I can think of the best way to summarize it, we are trying to formulate a rigorous framework for mapping out the logical possibility space of the creative choices that would be open to God in creating embodied rational creatures. So what would be the trade-offs involved when people say, oh, but God could have made the world basically like ours, but with this bit different. But they often don't do the work of kind of mapping out in full detail what that world would be like, what types of laws it would have, and so on. And so what we're trying to do is saying this kind of thing needs to be done in a disciplined way, where we're actually systematically trying to map out the possibility space. So yeah, that's what the book's about.
So I'm guessing you're going to touch upon the problem of evil as well. Obviously, that's
Yes, that's right. So we're not going to offer a theodicy, but we do think what we'll be saying will have some bearing on those debates.
brilliant. Looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much, Max, for
Thanks,
your
Sabur.
time. I hope to have you again in the future. It was
Absolutely, I'd love to
delightful.
come back.
Cheers.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks again, Sabur.